Hello, and welcome to the next part of our storefront introduction. In the last videos, I showed you how the basic data flow between storefront and Makaira looks like, and how we decide which React component to render, based on the data from the Makaira page editor. In this video, we get to finish the topic components by showing you how to actually work with them in the storefront, how to create your own React components, how to define markup, styling, a data structure, how to work with different variants of a component, and finally, how you can create this component in Makaira and make it editable in the page editor. All this and much more in this video. Let's start straight away and create a new component. You basically have two options for creating a component in the front end. Option 1 is that you manually create the files that are necessary by yourself. However, I recommend sticking to option 2 to use the storefront CLI. We provide a rudimentary CLI for the storefront, and if you go to the Makaira documentation under Storefront Workflows, you will find an area Create Patterns, and there is an npx command stored npx storefront create:pattern. As usual, you can find the link to the documentation in the video description. I'll grab this command now and just execute it locally. For this, I will copy it into my terminal and think of a pattern name. We will just use test pattern as an example. Very important, components always start with capital letters, not with lowercase letters. Pressing enter, and you see, it didn't take long. To see what happened here, I run a git status. Now I see the changes compared to the last commit. We see here 3 changes were made and 1 unversioned file was created. Let's start with the new file. We see there is a new folder, test pattern, in patterns. Let's take a look at that. We have a folder named pattern. This might be the first time you see this folder, and all you need to know is that this is the folder in which we store all of our React components for the Makaira storefront. The naming might be a bit confusing, but patterns is simply another word for components that we use, especially the editors and designers, because they can relate more to the term patterns. When we developers talk about components, we usually mean React components. But the bottom line is that both words have the same meaning in the Makaira world. Let's open the folder and see that we already have 2 folders, a core folder and a folder for our test pattern. Before I explain to you the folder for the test pattern, a very brief background on what is in the core. Namely, in the core folder are all the components that we deliver out of the box. Let's jump into the folder for a moment and see that there is quite a lot in here. For example, footer, header, also the teaser hero, which we have often seen in recent videos. So everything we have in terms of React components out of the box is here in the core, and everything we sort of have beyond that, which is project specific, will be located in the patterns folder next to the core folder. In this case, for example, the test pattern has its own folder in this patterns folder. So let's take a closer look at the test pattern folder. We see 3 files in here. This is the bare minimum we need to create a component in the storefront. Starting with Index.js, this is the entry point for the file or the component, because of the function we see in here. It returns a section, which is not a class component, but a pure function component. This is the file that we use to define all of our markup, or, if necessary, to define logic for the component. This file exports the function by default, and we also export content from a variance file. I'll explain what's going on with this one later. In addition, we have a testpattern.style file. This is the file in which we define the styling for this component, and from the file extension .style, you might already recognize that stylus is the preprocessor that we use to define our styling. This means that if you have never used stylus or are not familiar with preprocessors in general, I definitely recommend that you take a look at the stylus documentation. You can find the link in the video description. Last but not least, the third file is a variance.js file. I already had mentioned it because it is exported from Index.js. The explanation for all of this will be in a future video. In addition to this folder and the 3 associated files, some additional files were changed. Let's check again in the console, and we see the changes were made in Index.js and Index.style in the patterns folder. I'll explain what happened here. In Index.style, we collect all the stylus files that we need for our storefront. This is the entry point from which the CSS is then generated. We see a lot of input statements like the basic layouts, font, typography, and colors. a reset.style to reset browser-specific things, but also all the stylings for the patterns. You see a lot from the core here, and at the end, we also see project-specific styles, such as our test pattern, which we import here. We also have the Index.js in the patterns folder. What it's all about is a bit more complex. I have to explain this a little deeper. As you can see here, we are exporting the default from a file. Let's take our teaser hero for example. We already know that one. This line says export the default from core/teaser hero, which is what this file exports as the default. If we take a look here, we see that the teaser hero is exported by default, meaning we could rename what it exports. However, we stick to the name that we basically export there, or, for example, below with our test pattern, we export the default of test pattern. For example, the test pattern gets exported as test pattern. This may seem a bit strange at first glance, and I'll explain to you in a moment why we're doing this. We have our content elements in the patterns/core folder, and, as I demonstrated in the last video, we have a mapping of identifiers from Makaira to components from the storefront. These components have to be imported from somewhere, and we see that up here. We do not import the components from the absolute paths, so there is no import teaser hero from patterns/core/teaser hero here. But we go 2 levels upwards with a relative path. And if we anticipate the content element, which would lead us here in the content elements folder, then up once more to the core folder again, and then we're in the patterns folder. There are no files in here that are being referenced, but that is implicit in this notation and means the Index.js file. This refers implicitly to the Index.js file. This means we import the teaser hero that the Index.js exports from patterns, shown right here. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, why are you taking a detour of using a file as a sort of switch instead of just importing it directly? The reason for this is the following. It is quite common in real projects that various core patterns are used, but not always as we have defined them in the core. Instead, functionality will be adjusted, the markup will be adjusted, the styling will be adjusted, and of course, the components in the core can also be adjusted. Now, if I would say, I'd like to change the teaser hero in whatever way, I could do so in the core folder. However, this will lead to the point that if you update the teaser hero in the storefront and you need a pull to get the new storefront update, you are guaranteed to get merge conflicts. So the best practice is that if I'm using one of the core components and want to customize it, I'll take that folder, copy it once, and then paste it on the level next to core. Basically, like we did with test pattern. Then, of course, I have to adjust a few more paths. For example, I import a component in Index.js called conditional link, which we get from somewhere else. This path no longer works because the folder has now been moved. I still have to adjust that, but that's not so important for us right now, because how we expand or adapt components that come from the core is explained in more detail in a separate video. For us, however, the only decisive thought is we want to change the teaser hero and assume that everything we need has now been adjusted. Then, when I maintain this teaser hero in the page editor, I want my customized teaser hero to be rendered and no longer the one from the core. So, I need to go into patterns/index.js and adjust the export. I comment out the export here below with the project-specific entries referencing the teaser hero, which is located directly in the patterns folder. This, however, has the consequence that I don't have to change anything else in other places where I import this teaser hero. So I no longer have to touch where the teaser hero comes from in the content elements because we defined very clearly, take the teaser hero reference that is exported from patterns/index.js. We don't really care where it lives because we just want to have the right teaser hero and we defined the right teaser hero at this point. That gives us some flexibility, and we have fewer dependencies if, for example, we want to import components into other components. Then, when I change the component, I don't have to change the absolute paths in all possible places, but I can say that in all places where I access React components, we refer to this Index.js, which allows us to ensure that we can use the components we want in all places. That was our little detour into our file structures and how we work with imports and exports. I'll undo that one again because we don't want to break anything. I also delete the teaser hero folder again, and now you're probably wondering, okay, now I have this test pattern folder, and I also have a component that I can theoretically use. But can I do anything with it since it hasn't been added in the Makaira admin yet? The answer is very clear. Yes, of course you can. Because the storefront is intended to be as developer-friendly as possible. The developer experience is very important to us, and that's why it's also possible to test and work with the component locally without receiving any data from Makaira. For this topic, I introduce you to a new concept that we have in the storefront, named the pattern library. In a way, it is a tool within our tool, and I can call it up when I go to localhost port 5000/Pally. I've already prepared that. You'll see a menu structure with various entries on the left. What the pattern library does in detail will be part of another video. In our context, it's only important to know that the pattern library gives us the opportunity to work locally with the components and to look at certain variants as they would appear in a real use case. I have a placeable components category in the menu on the left. This category shows all components that are intended to be placed on pages in the Makaira page editor. For example, our teaser hero. When I click, we see that the teaser hero is rendered and ready. If I scroll down a bit, we also see different versions. For example, with a button and below that without a button. The title also says without button. That is interesting. Alternatively, it also exists without an overlay at all. I can even scroll further down and see an example with nothing but the picture. This means there are different variants of the same component. This means that I have 5 different variants of this teaser hero component, but with different possible datasets. These are living in the variant.js that I skipped in the beginning. The variant.js is a file that we only need exclusively in context of the pattern library. We achieve the variants with the help of objects. You see here an array is exported, and each entry in this array is an object. This allows us to define different variants of the same component and provide them with different datasets. With the help of it, we can check in the pattern library how the components change with different datasets. To illustrate this, we're going to use our test pattern as an example. The name is default, which is the identifier, and props is an object. In there, I define the data that is passed to the component as properties. Let's take a look at the pattern library again. There, when we open the test pattern, we first see that test pattern is written here. That's exactly what is defined in our Index.js. So we already have hard-coded content that we're seeing and up here called default. This is the variant I called default. Now, I want to show you what it looks like when I work with real data. I have my test pattern, expect certain properties, or props, and would like to output the title from my props instead. So I expect this component to get a props.title. To add this, I go to my variants.js and can create a title under props. For example, Hello World. Then I save and see that nothing happens currently. It is therefore advisable to open this component in a separate tab with this button, because then I have a direct connection via browser sync. Otherwise, I would have to reload the page in the tab always. Now that I have a direct sync with the browser and make changes to this variant, I see them directly in the browser. We now see the Hello World that I defined as a property for this variant, which is then output when the variant gets returned. For example, if I change this to "the storefront is great," then we see the text has changed. With this feature, I can now create different variants of my component. In our sense, variants are just a component with different datasets. The property structure remains the same. So I don't just change the type of properties and say now the part is a string and then it's an integer. Only the content changes. For example, I can say, as a very simple example, I want to see a variant that has a long title. Then I just change the title and throw in a few random lines. Then let's see what my component looks like with a longer text. This can be the case, for example, if I want to check if I have unnecessary line breaks somewhere or if it is formatted correctly. Of course, that's a bit meaningless in our example, but if we look at the teaser hero again, it makes a bit more sense. Because now I see a variant in which I have maintained all the data. It is called fully featured. When I look up here, I have everything, like title, heading, content, button, and so on. And now I have a variant where nothing was specified in the properties for the button. Then I want to see if the component causes an error or if the button is not displayed. Is the component doing what I expect? Because I also have to consider that, what does the component do if certain data that I actually expect is not given? I can test that here too. What happens if the content for an overlay is not given? What happens if I don't maintain anything except the image, and so on? The possibilities are nearly endless. I think that the core idea of how it works is clear by now. We use variants to test the component in different forms with different datasets. Let's look at the component again, but more in depth. We have our component here, and I can customize this component as I like, since it's basically just React. I can define my markup. I can define even more properties. I can also define logic if I need any interactivity. Of course, I can also adjust the styling. I can take a look at my test pattern.style here and change the text color to red. Bang! And now after the browser sync, the color changed to red. That means I can start as soon as the component has been created using the CLI command. I can call the component directly in the pattern library, open it in a separate tab, and then get started. So I can consider, which HTML structure do I need? What styling do I need? What data structure do I need? What data am I expecting? I can also first define a data structure that I can work with locally, and only later I have to think about how to translate this data structure into the Makaira page editor. At this point, I would like to give you a few hints. From experience, especially for colleagues or developers that are new to the storefront or may not be so familiar with the workflow or React, there are many reasons why you may not start with developing right away. To give you a little orientation, we recommend a certain workflow to be able to work on a component in a structured way. This means that we recommend starting with creating the component, naming it using the CLI, and then you should first think about, what is the point of this component? What do I want to achieve with it? What data do I need? Is something interactive? Or do I need things that are dynamic in terms of the maintainable datasets? Is there also content that is hard-coded, such as certain texts? So, first gather all the information you need. And then, before you start to define the properties and styling in HTML, you should roughly think about your HTML structure. That means you take a piece of paper and draw which containers you actually need and how they are nested. So ask yourself, which elements do I use? Do I use a div, section, or a list so that it also makes sense semantically to avoid creating a nested div mess? The next thing you should think about is that the content fits on all breakpoints. This means to follow a responsive first approach. So first, define a rudimentary styling that ensures that the content itself is correctly placed on all breakpoints, and only when you have a functioning HTML structure and know that it fits semantically and SEO-wise if needed. Especially with regard to headings, you should take H1, H2, H3, or whatever into account. But also consider, do you need a CSS grid? A flexbox? Does the content fit? And only then you should start with fine styling, such as distances, colors, typography, the whole topic of interactivity, meaning events that should happen when a button gets clicked or something similar. Only when you have gone through all these steps and know that it fits locally and that this component meets your specifications, you have to think about transferring this component to Makaira. That's exactly what we're doing now. So, I want my test pattern, which I can see locally, to be maintainable in the Makaira page editor. To do this, I go to Makaira and call up the dashboard. You may already be familiar with the component editor from the previous videos. Here is where I can create a new component for my test pattern. I give it the name test pattern and an identifier. Remember, the identifier is the crucial field that I can later use to map the content elements in the storefront. I call it test pattern, and I can choose an icon to show the content creators how this element looks structurally. Not relevant for now, so I click Save and now an entry has been created. Now, of course, I still have to make it possible to use this component in the page editor so that I can fill a text field there, which will then get me a title property in the storefront. To do this, I go to Edit Fields, then I can add a new field. A new field is always an input option in the page editor. That's why it gets a label, a title, and an ID. The ID is very important because it is the identifier of how this field arrives as a property in the storefront. That's why I call it title, because we know our property is called title. As I type, it's a text. That's perfectly fine for me. I can save that, and if we briefly go back into Edit Fields, we see in the API Preview tab how the component properties would arrive in the storefront. So, it's an object with a title and a text value. This is the structure, so to speak, of how the raw data arrives. We remember that in content elements, when I've done the mapping for my component, we destructured the content of the entry, and these are the properties I get for rendering. That means in content, there would be a key title with the value, which I set in the page editor. Now I go to the page editor. By the way, now we've paced through the component editor for now. Of course, there are many more possibilities. There are certain best practices that we will go into more detail in a separate video. Here I have my page editor now. I call up the storefront start page, and now I want to add my test pattern via add component. I can see it here on the left. We also see an icon, which is simply the default icon because I haven't specified a different one. If you click on test pattern, then you can enter the title here. I just write hello world and save it. To see if something is already happening, I pull the element up and we see there is a note here. Front-end component not implemented yet. This is shown because, as we see above, the preview runs on demo.makaira.cloud and not on localhost. The deployed version of the storefront under demo.makaira.cloud does not have the code for this component yet. But I can enter my localhost here. So I can enter my http://localhost port 5000/preview route for that. Reload the preview and see there I have the same problem. I can't see my component. This is an indication that I forgot to do the mapping. So I look again in my code and see under content elements that there is no entry for this component, and as long as the entry is not there, the storefront shows an error. For me, this means that I enter my test pattern here as the key. This is the identifier I gave via the component editor. Enter the reference to my test pattern, save the whole thing, and see, bang! There was even a browser sync, and now my component is here. I change the text again to, the storefront is still great. Save it, and see it in the preview. And of course, I also see it when I call it up locally in my browser. So you can see the basic workflow for creating a component and filling it with data from Makaira is relatively straightforward. I just have to remember to add this mapping in the content elements component, and then I can use it right away. Before I end the video, I'd like to summarize what we've learned. We started out by allowing you to create components in the storefront in two ways. One is to create the files manually or via the CLI, which is the recommended way because it's just much faster that way. Then we filled the component with the necessary React code. We used the variant.js file to think about a basic data structure and use this data in your component by accessing the properties. We also defined our styling via the stylus file of this component. I have shown you in the patterns folder via the Index.js and Index.style files how we can find the entry points to import the styling once, and also via the Index.js how we can import the components for the whole storefront. You have also seen that you can view your component locally in the pattern library, which you can call up via /pally in a separate tab. So you can work locally, completely detached from Makaira, on your data structure, and first see whether the whole component fits in terms of markup, styling, and responsive behavior. And last but not least, I showed you in the Makaira dashboard how you can create a component via the component editor and how you can fill it with data in the page editor. With all of this, we have reached the end of the video again. One more note. The topic pattern library is a bit more extensive. There's a separate video for that. But if you can't wait to take a deep dive into it, then again, I recommend the storefront documentation in the Makaira docs. There, you'll find some interesting information about it. And with that in mind, I'm looking forward to the next video.